we don't have standards, we don't have standards, how can you offer correction? A missionary to Turkey once told me the most difficult thing in Turkey is getting around because they don't have any traffic laws. In fact, first, pedestrians do not have the right-of-way. And it's not unusual to be on a bus, see someone trying to scoot across the road and not make it. And the bus just keeps rolling along. On major highways, they'll have like a 4-lane highway. No lane has any set direction. No lane has any set direction. It didn't at the time that this missionary was there. And so you can be driving down the highway and see a grill coming for you. In fact, you can be 4 abreast driving down the highway and see 4 grills abreast coming at you. And somehow, at the last minute, cars reshuffle and they pass each other. There aren't a lot of accidents, apparently.
I was wondering why they called it Turkey. Now that makes sense.
There you go. And we thought the intellectuals were going to be offended, right? No rules, no standards. And she was told, really, don't drive in Turkey. And just be very, very careful when you try to get around. Because transportation in Turkey is dangerous. Oh, they don't have inspection either. So you can imagine what kind of vehicles are driven around. Anyway, not to bust on that, just the point that when there are no standards and no rules, there is chaos. And yeah, people manage to negotiate somehow, but it's still chaos. How can you tell people in Turkey to drive on the right side of the road when, well, if I'm driving on the road, I'm doing fine. I even think that's negotiable, actually. You know, how do you tell people who don't believe in right or wrong that what they're doing is bad and harmful, ultimately? They have a tough time listening to that. How do you tell church people that some of the beliefs you cherish are not biblical, but social? How do you tell believers that some of those principles they have upheld for years and years are social customs and not spiritual expression? Or at least they're not universal spiritual expressions. You know, what one culture does as an expression of faith, but that's wonderful. That is history. That is testimony. But trying to impose that upon the next generation becomes legalism. You can't. And vice versa, by the way. Anything you try to impose upon someone else, anything that's your personal thing, you try to impose upon someone else specifically, becomes like the law. Testimony is not theology. Testimony is a personal application of theology. And yes, people have tremendously varied expressions of theology in their testimonies. But, you know, there's a common truth upon which it is based, but it's still lived out individually. You've got to keep both of those things in tension. How do we even talk about that stuff, actually? Yeah, that's usually what happens. Paul wrote to the Corinthian congregation and pointed out their shortcomings. And they didn't like it. They were sorrowful. They were offended. They didn't like Paul very but then they realized the power and truth in what he was saying, and suddenly they realized, man, we really did mess up. What were we thinking? It seemed like a good idea at the time. Made sense when we were doing it, but we just didn't think the whole thing through completely, did we? We need to change. And in their change, it wasn't just, we have a different tradition, we have a different way of doing that now. They really got on fire for what was right and what was good. And they didn't wallow in guilt. And they didn't try to hide their mistakes or their shortcomings. 2 Corinthians talks about the worldly repentance that leads to death.